right now, it's probably a question of when and not if China emerges as a science and technology power.
You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in US news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news. Hello, I'm Mari Kirk, Director of Engagement and Impact at the United States Study Center. Thanks for joining us on the USSC Briefing Room today. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're recording on today. The University of Sydney is located on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. From the Quad Principles on Critical and Emerging Technology to Aus Pillar 2, technology is increasingly seen as an issue of national security, and it is playing a larger role than ever in U.S. alliances and partnerships in the Indo-Pacific. What is driving this technological cooperation? What can allies and partners gain by working together on it? And what's next on the tech agenda for the alliance? To discuss these questions, we're pleased to welcome USSC non-resident fellow Jennifer Jackett, a Sir Roland Wilson Scholar at ANU's National Security College, who has extensive experience in advising government on cross-cutting policy issues. Her current research looks at the US-China competition for leadership over advanced and emerging technologies and the implications for US allies and partners. Welcome to the podcast, Jennifer.
Thanks so much, Mari. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. And at the end of this episode, we'll get your by-the-numbers stat on this topic, so I'm looking forward to hearing that. Now, as I mentioned, technology is playing this increasing role in U.S. relationships in the region. So last year, we added a third pillar to the U.S.-Australia alliance, and it's focused on critical minerals and technology for the clean energy transition. We also have Aus Pillar 2, and then if you look at the joint statements following the most recent Quad summits, technology is getting more and more airtime as part of that relationship. So what do you think is driving this growing emphasis on technology in the context of these sort of international alliances?
Yeah, great question. It's such a dynamic and fast-moving area, but I think there are three big factors we can draw out to understand what's going on. The first one is that there is a long-standing relationship between technology and national power. So the ability of countries to develop, adopt, and also diffuse technology throughout their economy, it generally improves their relative power to other states in the international system, both economic and military. The second thing that's going on is the speed and scale of technological disruption that we're seeing today. In many areas, there are rapid advances occurring, whether that's communications technology, applications of artificial intelligence, or areas like quantum sensing and communications. And many of those advances are also being fueled by the intersections of some of these technologies, especially applications of artificial intelligence in a range of those areas. So we're in a period of pretty big upheaval in both our economy and our society, and that's creating opportunities and challenges in a strategic context. There's also, finally, I think, a shifting balance of power, of technological power in the international system underway. And what I mean by that is in the past decade or more, we've seen China's emergence as a more capable technological power. And that's also underpinned its military modernization, the growth of globally influential technology companies, and also a bigger role that it's trying to play in technology governance like standard settings. What that has meant, though, is that there's also been a relative decline in the power and influence of the US and its allies. So I think those three factors together, the power of technology, the speed and scale of disruption we're seeing, and the shifting balance, are all affecting technology and making it a priority in a geopolitical context and relationships among states. We've seen that play out, like you mentioned, in the context of AUKUS and defense technology, but also in the Quad. And the reason that the US is looking to partners is because the US knows that it can't go it alone to maintain its technology leadership. These technology supply chains are global. they're integrated, and many countries have a role to play, like on something like semiconductors. The US has to work with partners like Japan, the Netherlands, South Korea to protect and maintain its advantages.
So technology has a huge role both on, the national security side and things like AUKUS, but also on that economic prosperity and even a development piece. And like you said, the governance, the rules of the road going forward. So in this period of such rapid change, how are different US allies thinking about technology competition?
In short, there's a diversity of views, and that comes down to often the different role that countries play in global supply chains. Many countries are motivated by unique commercial or economic interests, but it also relates to countries' threat perceptions of China and what China's rise as a technology power might mean for them. And so, although we've seen broad alignment among countries like the Five Eyes, other countries, like European countries, for instance, have probably taken longer to recognize some of the challenges that China's technological advancement and technological trade presents to their economic and security interests. This divergence among allies is actually the key question that I'm looking at in my PhD. I'm trying to explain why countries are making different technological choices despite the US's expectation that they have for alignment on these strategic issues. So, in the last few years, I've had the opportunity to speak with almost 80 former ministers, heads of government agencies, and experts in 8 different countries. And I was looking at case studies of 5G security decisions and also semiconductor export controls. And what my research showed is just how complex and contested these decisions are in every country. And they often involve intersecting security, economic, industry, foreign policy, and also alliance issues. So, what I've developed through my PhD is it's a bit conceptual or theoretical, but I'm looking at different ally archetypes that can explain this variation. So you have countries' choices that might fall more into a defender category where they privilege their security concerns over their economic concerns. You have balances that are really trying to weigh both opportunities to kind of mitigate risk, but also protect their commercial and industrial advantages. And then you have more industrialist nations that probably put to the side some of the security concerns and are privileging the concerns of their commercial companies or their industries. And what's really interesting is that these 3 different archetypes have different effects on US strategy against China. So some allies can be enablers of US strategy against China, some allies can be constrainers, even. Or they can be shapers, like Australia's 5G decision back in 2018 really drew global attention to some of the risks that using Chinese hardware in your 5G network can present. And it focused a global conversation and really global action on those issues. So the outcome of that research is showing the different ways that allies actually shape the trajectory of US China competition. This isn't all about the great powers. Other countries have a role to play. But it also shows the practical reality of coordination among allies, because even though allies might agree on what the problem is or the challenge or threat that China presents, they certainly don't agree on the how to respond. And they're motivated by different commercial and economic interests. The other thing, too, I'd just add is that across both the former Trump administration and the current Biden administration, one point I did pick up in my research is that there's such a sense of urgency in Washington about competing with China, including on technology. And that sense of urgency is not always felt among other US allies. And so there are really interesting rub points, points of friction about, our allies going far enough and fast enough. And that still persists to this day.
I think that's a really helpful framework to think about the differences between different countries in their approach, and if they have the same goal but a different desired way to get there, or how they're choosing to balance the different factors, and that can lead to different decisions. That's really interesting. And I'd like to think about that, I guess, in the context of, the Quad relationship between the United States, Australia, Japan, and India, that is an interesting alignment of countries because they came together first after the Boxing Day tsunami of 2004, in their relief efforts. And then they've kept this relationship going in different iterations. And it has started to evolve into, some national security, but a lot for regional prosperity, a lot for development. It's expanded its remit so much. But one of the challenges is that those countries really do have different approaches, especially in areas of, technology or defense. So they've got a lot of common goals, but they've got some different goals, and they definitely have different ways of how they would choose to implement the how of getting there. So if we look at technology in the context of the Quad, what are the current focus areas? What do they hope to achieve, and how do they kind of come together if they're sitting in these different archetypes or personas?
Yeah, it's quite remarkable in a sense that these 4 different countries, they have come together and identified a common interest in a free and open Indo-Pacific, and that technology is one of the priority streams of work, both how they can provide technological goods to the region, but also how they can bolster the foundations of their own competitiveness. Um, right now, I think they've got 3 focal areas or 3 tracks of work that we can really drill into. One is that piece about public goods I mentioned, and so that's around providing regional assistance to other countries outside the Quad, and that's in areas like cyber and digital skills, digital infrastructure investment, and also technical assistance on things like subsea cable security. The second area that the Quad is focusing on is shaping global technology governance to better align with liberal democratic values, but also presumably the commercial interests of their countries. So that is happening through things like technology standard setting bodies. They're coordinating the types of positions that they might take to those fora. They've, as you mentioned at the start, come up with principles on technology design and governance. And they're also doing some research reports they've published on things like alternative hardware to improve telecommunications vendor diversity beyond companies like the Chinese company Huawei. But one of the more interesting parts, I think, of the Quad's agenda that probably gets a bit less attention because it's less about the region and it's more about the Quad countries themselves is the intra-Quad cooperation that's happening to bolster their own competitiveness and resilience. So they've set up things like STEM, talent and workforce initiatives, providing PhD scholarships to the best and brightest to go study in the US initially. They're doing horizon scanning to understand what are the technologies that are coming that might have strategic implications. And they're also working more closely or trying to establish really a network with private sector representatives and investors to spur technology development. So those 3 things all have different focal points. One sort of looking at the region, one's looking more at global governance, and the other is looking inwards. I think for now, it's quite an expansive agenda. A lot of it is, stuff where they actually do have an alignment of interests. We haven't seen things like coordination on industrial policy or even on more sort of restrictive measures like foreign investment screening or export controls. A lot of the agenda so far has tried to be really positive and focused on what they can sort of add to their own economies or that of the region.
And so that piece of the work together in collaboration on technology almost sounds like a tech accelerator, in a lot of ways. That's really fascinating to think of the Quad and these countries working together in that context. Is there anything that you would like to see included following the next Quad summit? What will you be having your eyes on?
Yeah, well, I think one thing to note is that the Quad, in a sense, hasn't had the chance to build the same kind of momentum this year, maybe as it has over the last few years. And that's just because of different elections underway, especially the recent elections in India, given that India is this year's Quad host and also the upcoming US elections mean that we don't necessarily have the time frame set for the next Leaders Summit. And I suspect we won't know that till after the US election outcome. So I think once they do have an opportunity to come together again at that leaders level, it's probably important for them to be able to highlight the ways in which that momentum has not been lost and the activities that have continued to advance, through the hard work of their bureaucracies and the partnerships happening in the region. I think that the Quad already has quite an expansive agenda, not just in technology, but also health and infrastructure, other areas that you mentioned earlier. So, from my perspective, doubling down on delivery and locking in some of those gains that they've already made should be the priority, at least for the next leaders meeting. Having said that, I think one area in the technology space where there's probably an opportunity to do more is through the Quad Investors Network. So that was established about a year ago in May. And like I alluded to previously, it's trying to facilitate and address barriers to investment in strategic sectors like clean energy or semiconductors. And so they've done some collaborative initiatives behind the scenes. There's been a major investment in a US battery plant by an Indian company of around 650 million US dollars, so quite substantial, that was attributed to some of the work done by the Quad Investors Network. So I think seeing more success stories like that, more investments like that wouldn't have happened anyway, I think that is the test of success for something like the Quad Investors Network and something where they can make a real difference on the ground. So
Oh,
I would love to be seeing more of that going into the next Quad Leaders meeting.
yeah. So less of the new announceables and more of actualizing the plans and the things that they've shared already. I want to make sure we talk about a huge part of technology in relation to alliances right now is AUKUS Pillar 2. And that's the Advanced Technologies pillar of AUKUS. So people are quite familiar with Pillar 1, and that's the nuclear powered submarines. But Pillar 2 is really all about all these advanced technologies. And you published a report on AUKUS Pillar 2 a couple of years ago, and you outlined the key areas of tech cooperation. And what has changed for on Pillar 2 since you wrote that report? And how would you say we're going in terms of progress at the moment?
Yeah, so my report was from mid 2022, which was less than a year after the announcement of AUKUS. So, as you mentioned, the focus of that report was really thinking through what is the strategic logic of AUKUS Pillar 2 and what is the early work that Australia, as a really critical partner in the whole partnership, could undertake to help lay the foundations for success. So, my recommendations at the time were more some baselining work to understand what the areas of comparative advantage were between the three countries in these high tech sectors. What is some best practice that they could share early on some of the enabling functions for AUKUS, like defense technology acceleration? What else could AUKUS partners do in the early stages to think about the talent pipeline, which is highly competitive among the three countries? How could they think about talent in a more sort of collective way and even share some of the limited talent, particularly on the Pillar 1 side? And maybe they could also think about creating some secure infrastructure for joint research and technology development. So they were some really early suggestions to try and help get the partnership off the ground. So, what has changed since then, a couple of years later? I think, firstly, in a strategic sense, the logic for AUKUS has probably only become clearer. The global geopolitical context is more dangerous following Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. We also have the Israel Gaza conflict. There's also the growing strategic alignment that we're seeing between authoritarian powers and defense materiel support. So, between Russia and China, and also now North Korea and Russia. And meanwhile, closer to home, China continues its rapid military buildup and modernization and coercive behavior, especially in the maritime domain and the cyber domain. and the risk of a Chinese invasion or blockade of Taiwan still persists. So, all of that is to say that I think the strategic rationale for AUKUS has probably become even clearer, and the need for collective deterrence of hostile action in our region. But in a practical sense, the Pillar 2 agenda has substantially built out since I wrote that report. So there's quite a few different capability tracks of work focused in areas like artificial intelligence and autonomy, undersea warfare, and hypersonic systems. And that's intended to look at capabilities that, if successfully integrated, could provide an asymmetric advantage on the battlefield. A lot of this work is highly sensitive, so we don't necessarily have many details, although we have heard a few things come out, one of which was that AUKUS partners are already sharing algorithms to analyze the sound signatures of P-8 Poseidon aircraft. And we're probably likely to find out more as a result of, I think, a deliberate sort of reveal and conceal strategy by the three partners, when they consider the time is right. Apart from the capability tracks of work, there's been quite notable progress made on the key enabling legislation and regulation to support joint capability development and defence trade. And I know some of my USSC colleagues like Tom Corbin have written extensively and done excellent work on these issues. So at the end of last year, for instance, the US Congress passed critical legislation that provides a pathway for an exemption for Australia and the UK for certain defence trade, and it's likely to result in almost 70% of existing trade in defence items and services to become license free. So to streamline and support that integration of the defence industrial bases across the three countries. Apart from that enabling work, there's also other work occurring on innovation. So right now there's a simultaneous innovation challenge on electronic warfare being run by the three countries separately, by their three defence accelerators in each of the countries. And the plan is to share the winning solutions that come out of industry. And that will also help in these early stages, really, of closer innovation collaboration, help each country to understand each other's innovation ecosystem and how they can break down some of the barriers that might still exist. Lastly, I'd mention that on the sort of financing of defence technology, and again, I know Hayley Chan has done a great report on this issue. The Defence Investors Network for AUKUS has now been stood up, and so there's more than 300 venture capital firms and family offices that are worth around 265 billion US dollars that's been stood up to basically spur financing opportunities for Pillar 2 projects. And the network had its first meeting in February. So hopefully that sort of private sector-led financing of defence and dual-use technology can also accelerate and create different pathways for capability development in some of these really advanced areas. I just finished by saying, that's a lot of work that's occurring. And much of this work, despite the close collaboration that, of course, already exists within the Australia-US alliance and between the US and the UK, Australia and the UK, there's still a lot of work as part of AUKUS that's new and that's hard. And so it's taken time, I think, for the three bureaucracies to get the sort of governance and legal and administrative settings right. And they're probably working against pressure from political leaders in all three countries to try and produce tangible capability results quite quickly. But I think what we'll see, and I hope what we'll see, is that, the second and third time that AUKUS partners try and do something, whether that's the innovation type challenge or something else, things will get easier and they'll start to see results, especially once this enabling work, the legislation on trade controls, even some of the innovation work, once that's bedded down a little bit more.
And in the context of the heightened geopolitical tensions, we are seeing a lot more talk about JAWS or potentially expanding, Pillar 2 to include Japan or other allied countries. And so it seems like not only has AUKUS as a concept grown from being something where, most Americans had no idea what it is, and now they're gaining more awareness of it, other countries are taking notice and actually wanting or expressing some desire, and from the AUKUS countries seem to be expressing some interest in pursuing expanding Pillar 2 to include other countries in some way. What do you think is the likelihood of expanding AUKUS Pillar 2? And what do the countries both in currently in AUKUS and other potential partner countries stand to gain from it?
Yeah, this is a really difficult question, I think, for policymakers and an important one to think through carefully. So we do know that at the last AUKUS defence ministers meeting, leaders from the three countries, or sorry, the defence ministers from the three countries said in their statement that they're considering cooperating with Japan on AUKUS Pillar 2 advanced capability projects. So I think we are likely on that basis to see some limited collaboration at least. And that's not about involving Japan in everything on Pillar 2, but select projects where I presume they assess it's mutually beneficial. And I think Japan as a high-tech power, as a close strategic partner of the US and Australia in particular, it makes sense to explore opportunities to do more with them. And Japan has a lot to put on the table in areas like hypersonics, cyber applications of artificial intelligence, for example. But I think there's also a few points, I guess, more of caution or things that I would think about in considering expanding AUKUS Pillar 2 to include Japan or other countries. So the first is that it's already challenging among the AUKUS partners to negotiate and develop arrangements, whether that's the tech transfer reforms or agreeing on which projects to pursue, what's a shared priority. So the risk, of course, is that including other partners in that means that things take longer and they might be more complicated. The second point I would think about is that AUKUS is not the only mechanism, of course, for countries to collaborate on militarily relevant science and technology. There's nothing precluding collaboration with countries like Japan bilaterally, trilaterally, through other contexts. I think a third point, which is quite important, is around information and cybersecurity and the protection of sensitive defence technologies. So Australia, the US, and UK are all a part of the Five Eyes and have exceptionally high security standards in place for sharing classified information. And more broadly, all three countries, in their own ways, have done work to better secure their research and industry sectors from espionage and unwanted technology transfer. So the inclusion of any country, including Japan, beyond that group, I think does require really careful consideration of how that technology would be protected. Um, the other thing I think to think about is by including a country like Japan, what sort of expectation or interest might that provoke from other countries who want to join and close partners, and how would the AUKUS partners handle those requests? So how do you kind of stop that becoming bigger from Ben-Hur and AUKUS becoming the catch-all, I guess, for all defence tech cooperation, which I'm not sure. Yeah, like I said, I don't know if that would necessarily support it working quickly towards the kinds of outcomes that the AUKUS partners are seeking. And then the last point in all of this to consider is how might the inclusion of Japan, even in a limited way, or other countries be perceived by other countries in the region, including countries like China that have previously sought to spread disinformation about the intentions of the AUKUS partnership. And those kind of reactions are not a reason not to do something. It's just something that requires management. So, especially so that you don't undermine, I guess, the broader intentions of the group.
And so it's really about finding that sweet spot between, the benefits that each party brings, but the complications that come with it. It reminds me of that proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So there's definite benefits that come in working together with these other allies and partners, but it gets a lot more complicated, and each new dynamic you add to that makes it more complex. And in the world of technology, which is evolving so quickly, speed is essential. So finding that sweet spot where you balance those things is critical. I'm keen to touch on your specific focus of research around US China tech competition. So, how would you say that they are stacking up in terms of technology competition at the moment? And what are the steps that the United States is taking in regard to this competition, and how effective do you think they will be?
Yeah, it might be a bit unsatisfying, but it's really hard to undertake a comprehensive assessment. There are many experts that look at China's technological modernization, industrialization, its advantages, and try to get the full picture. But that can be really challenging to do. Having said that, I think there's a few indicators that we can look at that tell us part of the story, at least, of China's growth trajectory. So, on high impact scientific research, for example, there's been some really groundbreaking and comprehensive work done by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute that looks at and compares high impact research across countries. And their research concludes that right now China leads in 57 out of 64 critical technology areas of research, and that includes AUKUS relevant technologies like hypersonics, electronic warfare, and undersea capabilities. So even though that's just one input, I guess, into China's innovation ecosystem, it is a really key sort of underlying component, and that's only on a growth trajectory. Also, in June this year, The Economist did quite a wide-ranging assessment of China's technological advances, and it concluded that China is already a leading scientific power in particular areas like chemistry, physics, and materials science. And we've also seen quite visibly China's military modernization and build-up, which is the largest of any country since the Second World War. So I think right now it's probably a question of when and not if China emerges as a science and technology power. And their aim is to be the science and technology power by 2050, and the artificial intelligence and standard setting power before then by 2030, which is just over 5 years away. So in response to China's ambitions and to its progress, we have seen a pretty comprehensive strategy that the US has put in place to maintain its own advantages, and where it deems it appropriate from a national security perspective, in a targeted way where possible, it's trying to constrain and slow Chinese advances. And there's been pretty broad continuity, I'd say, on key issues across the former Trump administration and the current Biden administration. So a helpful way to think about US technology strategy is across three pillars. So they have a protect pillar, a promote pillar, and a partner pillar. So the protect pillar is all about preserving US technology advantages through a range of mechanisms, things like inbound and outbound investment screening, export controls, things like due diligence around sensitive collaborations between universities and Chinese or other entities that might be of concern to protect that sensitive research and intellectual property theft. One of the most substantial and probably well-known protect measures were the US export controls on semiconductor manufacturing equipment that were put in place over the last few years. There's been a couple of major rounds of those. And really what those aim to do is to throw sand in the gears of China's efforts to develop its own advanced semiconductor industry and to be able to produce AI-related chips at scale that it could use for military capabilities. So the US is trying to buy time with that type of measure to allow itself and its allies to get as far ahead as possible. And based on what US Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo has said, they assess that the controls are slowing the Chinese down. It is preventing the Chinese from producing these advanced AI chips at scale. And we know that President Xi Jinping himself is concerned about these chips and has raised his concerns directly with President Biden on multiple occasions, including on the sidelines of APEC late last year and also in direct phone calls. But when it comes to those types of controls, it's one thing to put them in place, but what really matters is their enforcement. And a lot of that also comes down to the roles of allies and partners. In this case, the Dutch that have almost a 100% monopoly on advanced semiconductor tools, and also the Japanese. So these will require continued enforcement, continued evolution, because countries like China and other countries of concern will attempt to find ways to circumvent the controls, but also to continue to develop their own domestic industries. Um, Aside from the protect strategy, the promote strategy is all about investing in the foundations of US technological competitiveness. And we've seen some major US legislative packages like the US $280 billion Chips and Science Act, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act. And then lastly, the partner pillar, we've touched a little bit on that already. That's really around how the US can work with allies and partners to protect and promote their collective technological advantages. And so that includes minilaterals like the Quad and AUKUS that we delved into, but it also is happening through other fora like the EU, US Trade and Technology Council, or even groupings like the G7.
Mm. And on your point about the competition between the US and China being a bipartisan issue in the US, and especially around some of the technology policies, that there's been a high level of continuity from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. I think that's really telling. So I guess to just in terms of thinking about where to from here, what do you think we need to keep an eye on in terms of trends around technology in the alliance, and specifically, what might the impact of a second Trump administration be? If we've seen continuity from Trump to Biden, what would we expect to see if the White House goes back to Trump?
Yeah, I think one of the big areas for Australian policymakers to continually watch is US industrial policy and the sort of run faster agenda that they've got, including things like Chips and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, because that can create both opportunities and challenges from a sort of trade and economic perspective. It can benefit or privilege US companies, but it does provide opportunities for other countries to go and manufacture things like electric vehicles in the US, for instance. So, from a strategic standpoint, some of those initiatives are beneficial in that they're continually advancing US technology advantage. That's a good thing for Australia, but also it comes potentially with risks of protectionism and techno-nationalism, and we probably saw that a little bit more in the former Trump administration. So I guess policymakers need to look at what those opportunities are for Australia and also where some of those rub points might be. I think in an Australian context, we have seen a shift and a willingness to invest more in industrial policy than probably we have in the past, in recognition of the changing global economic context, in recognition of the growing strategic risk we're seeing across different supply chains, from clean energy through to advanced manufacturing. So in Australia, we've had things like the Future Made in Australia initiative announced in the recent budget. We've got the National Reconstruction Fund that includes $1 billion for technology, and some standalone investments in quantum companies like PsiQuantum. And of course, in defence and security, we're seeing huge investments made through AUKUS and even defence innovation through the Advanced Strategic Capabilities Accelerator. So I think they're all steps in the right direction. They don't necessarily match the speed and scale of what the US is doing, but we don't need to. We need to work out what's best for us. But I think there's an opportunity here as the US, Europe, Japan, South Korea, many of them focus on this sort of techno-industrial contest. Australia can probably do a bit more to think about how do we make ourselves even more competitive in that landscape. And there's broader challenges we still have in our economy around government investment in research and development funding, manufacturing capability, which is still the lowest in the OECD, and even financing challenges for startups in this country. So I think there's still scope for us to do more and run faster. and use that time, that window of opportunity that the US really and others are buying, to get as far ahead as we can. In terms of what uh, a Trump re-election might mean, a second Trump administration, I think it's instructive that in the first Trump administration, from a national security standpoint, I think Australia fared pretty well alongside other Quad partners, Japan and India. And there's probably a few lessons we can draw from that time that might help us engage well if there were to be a second Trump administration. I think the first thing is to showcase our national security credentials. So we already can anticipate that strategic rivalry with China, especially on technology, would be front and center of a second Trump term. And Trump himself has already made statements like he wants total independence from China and to stop China owning America. And if we look back at the first Trump administration, Australia gained a lot of credibility in the former Trump White House for its 2018 5G decision. And there's been a lot of other reforms Australia's done to make itself a harder target for espionage and interference. It's strengthened foreign investment frameworks, it's uplifted cyber and critical infrastructure resilience. And so, generally speaking, I think there's been a front footed and clear eyed approach to managing risks around China and also national security policy more generally. And that provides a pretty strong basis for productively engaging Trump and his team on those types of issues. I think the second thing we could have really as part of our strategy is to show the role that Australia is playing in burden sharing and deterrence. So we know that Trump wants peace through strength, and this includes countering adversaries as well as preventing allies from free riding on US security guarantees. And I think Australia has a pretty good message in terms of the commitment it's making to its own security in the alliance. So defence spending is set to increase to 2.3% of GDP within a decade. We've got force posture initiatives that have been expanded on Australian soil, like hosting American and British submarines through HMAS Sterling. And we've also invested, as Australia, about $6 billion into the US and UK industrial base to support our acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines. And then I think the final thing that's a lesson and that we can focus on is really the deal of AUKUS, because we know former President Trump is transactional, a deal maker. So we need to sell, I think, how the partnership makes Australia a more capable and lethal ally, how it bolsters regional defense supply chains, and ultimately how it contributes to US-led deterrence of conflict in the Indo-Pacific. But part of it too will be highlighting how it could be, especially Pillar 2, could be a boon for US companies rather than being a drain on their technology and industrial capacity and workforce.
Yeah, so Australia has a really good story to tell. And if there is a Trump 2.0 administration, all the things that he's messaged previously that he wanted from US allies and partners, Australia could say, yep, we've done that. 2% of GDP, yep, we're doing that, all of it. So it's a very good story to tell. Well, thank you so much for covering such a broad range of topics, but so critical to so many aspects of the US-Australia relationship right now. Before I let you go, I would love to get your by the numbers stat. What do you have for us today?
My stat is about the number of Chinese STEM PhD graduates that we're expecting by 2024, which is basically double now the US STEM graduates. So I think they're expected to have around 77,000 PhDs compared to the US's 40,000. And I think that's just really interesting to think about in terms of the long-term consequences and, the basis that provides for their innovation ecosystem and how that plays out over the long run between the US and China, given that that's such a foundational part of their innovation ecosystem. And I think it only reinforces the collaboration needed among allies because pooling talent among the US and all its partners does continue to provide a strategic advantage in this sort of techno-industrial contest for leadership.
Yeah. Oh, so fascinating. Really, really interesting. Well, thank you so much, Jen. As we wrap up, I'd like to point out a couple of other podcasts that might be of interest to our listeners. Um, the USSC CEO, Dr. Michael Green, is co host of the Asia Chessboard podcast with Jude Blanchette, the Freeman Chair for China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And I'd also recommend checking out the USSC Live podcast series that runs recordings from our major live events, including our 2024 Election Watch events. And Jen has kindly come onto some of our webinars in the past, so you can find her on some of the podcasts or some of the on the USSC Live podcast series. You can find her on there as well. So you can find these on our website at ussc.edu.au or wherever you get your podcasts. Once again, Jen, thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time today.
Thanks, Mari. It was great to talk to you about these really important issues.